Unit 4, Lecture 2. In this lecture, we will talk about red blood cells. Your reading is still in Chapter 17. Red blood cells have one important function. Their job is to transport respiratory gases, specifically oxygen and, to a smaller degree, carbon dioxide. And their entire structure accommodates that particular function. For example, the shape of these cells is what we call a biconcave. Imagine I have a sphere that I will squish from both sides, making kind of thinner in the center. That's biconcave. It provides the maximum surface area, and therefore exchange of gases will increase. The molecule that binds to oxygen in the red blood cells is called hemoglobin, and the red blood cell is literally stuffed with hemoglobin. In fact, it is so full of hemoglobin that there is no room for anything else. That's why red blood cells in the peripheral circulation do not have any nucleus and have hardly any organelles. Let's look at these two diagrams. Here you can see a superior and a side view of the red blood cell, and this is what I mean by concave. Do you see how it's thinner in the middle and thicker on the outside? It doesn't have a hole in the middle, and that's just an electron microgram that shows that. When the shape of red blood cells is altered in the course of different diseases, that affects its ability to carry oxygen because there is less surface area. For example, that's what we see in the sickle cell anemia. That's a genetic disorder where some red blood cells do not have this biconcave shape but have a sickle shape, just like you see on this diagram. And the danger here is not only that they will not carry oxygen quite as efficiently, but also the size of the capillaries, remember, is designed exactly to fit the red blood cell. But the sickle cells are sometimes quite bigger, and they plug capillaries like this and cause obstruction and destruction of other red blood cells. Another less severe type of disorders, we see spherocytosis, where red blood cells are not biconcave but spherical or round in shape. How do I know? Well, see, this is a biconcave shape. See, it's kind of lighter in the center, where this one, for example, is completely red. So it probably has somewhat a uniform thickness, so less surface area. Here you can see ovalocytosis, and again, this is not the optimal surface area. Therefore, oxygen carrying capacity of the blood here is diminished. Since it's hemoglobin that binds to oxygen and is responsible for carrying it, let's focus at it a little more. I definitely want you to know normal concentrations of hemoglobin for males and females. And I also want you to understand the role of hemoglobin. Hemoglobin is the molecule that binds to oxygen. It's very important for us to remember that it's a reversible bond that the hemoglobin forms with this gas. It also forms a reversible bond with carbon dioxide. Therefore, the same molecule is capable of transporting either oxygen or carbon dioxide. You've heard about carbon monoxide poisoning. The danger here is that carbon monoxide, unlike oxygen or carbon dioxide, bind to hemoglobin irreversibly. And of course, if enough hemoglobin is bonded with carbon monoxide, there is none that can transport oxygen. So let's look at the structure of hemoglobin molecule. It is composed of two major parts, protein globin, and there's not one but 4 chains here, and each of these chains are bound to a heme molecule. Each heme contains a ferrous ion that in fact binds to oxygen itself. Let's look at this diagram. Here you can see the globin portion. You see 2 alpha chains and 2 beta chains. Those are chains of amino acids, right? And each of the chains is connected to heme. In the center of each heme, you can see a ferrous ion, and that's the ion that binds to oxygen. So looking at this picture, how many oxygen molecules do you think one hemoglobin molecule can carry? Well, since each heme is capable of binding to one oxygen molecule, then of course 4 hemes will carry 4 oxygen molecules. Does that make sense? Very good. Because it's iron in the center of heme that binds to oxygen, it's obviously a very important ion in our diet. Iron deficiency will result in development of anemia. We call it hypochromic anemia because it's the heme that gives red blood cells and therefore blood cells this unique red color. So if there is not enough iron, there is not enough heme and hemoglobin formed, and red blood cells appear to be pale like they are on this image. And of course, these red blood cells are not going to be carrying oxygen to the tissues very well. Now, you probably have heard the expression blue blood. It's not a hearsay. There are some animals, crustaceans for example, that use copper to bind to oxygen. And that ion actually has blue color, and therefore their blood has blue tint to it. So blue blood is not really royalty. It's more like a crab. We said that hemoglobin also contains 4 protein chains or globin chains. Various mutations may result in abnormal chains in the globin part of hemoglobin, and that disorder is called thalassemia. Thalassemia also results in a lower oxygen carrying capacity. So on this diagram you see red blood cells of various shapes. That's what we call poikilocytosis. That's what we see with thalassemia. It's a genetic disorder. So how is it that hemoglobin carries gases? It can be found in 3 different states in our blood. Deoxyhemoglobin is what we see on this diagram, and it just has the globin and heme parts to it and no gases attached. Sometimes we call it reduced hemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is the molecule that is saturated with oxygen. Each of the heme molecules in red here are connected to oxygen molecule. Recall that each hemoglobin molecule can carry up to 4 oxygen molecules. And the last is carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin is hemoglobin that's connected to carbon dioxide molecules. Carbon dioxide does not bind in the same spot. In fact, it doesn't even connect to heme at all. It binds to the amino end of the globin chains, and only 2 of them have an exposed amino ends. Therefore, each hemoglobin molecule can only carry up to 2 carbon dioxide molecules. Let's start with deoxyhemoglobin in the lungs. When red blood cells circulate through the lungs, deoxyhemoglobin picks up oxygen, turning into oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin then travels to the peripheral tissues, where oxygen diffuses out, and the hemoglobin turns into deoxyhemoglobin. Deoxyhemoglobin picks up some carbon dioxide, and now we call it carbaminohemoglobin. Carbaminohemoglobin is delivered back to the lungs, where carbon dioxide diffuses out, leaving deoxyhemoglobin molecule to bind with oxygen molecules. Does that kind of make sense? Let's watch this animation again. So once more, in the lungs, carbaminohemoglobin dissociates to produce reduced hemoglobin and release carbon dioxide that we exhale. The reduced hemoglobin then picks up oxygen, turning into oxyhemoglobin. Oxyhemoglobin is transported to the tissues, where it dissociates into the reduced hemoglobin and the oxygen that travels into the cells. Whereas reduced hemoglobin picks up the carbon dioxide producing carbaminohemoglobin, and then of course travels to the lungs. Now, not only these equations are not balanced, another thing that you might have noticed is there is more oxygen transported by hemoglobin than carbon dioxide. So how do we transport the rest of carbon dioxide out? About 70% of carbon dioxide is transported in the form of bicarbonate ion. What happens is carbon dioxide is very soluble in water, and when it mixes with water, it forms carbonic acid that then dissociates into hydrogen ions and bicarbonate. And of course, this is what decreases the pH of blood, makes it more acidic. But of course, this reaction is reversible, and it changes directions in the lungs where carbon dioxide is released and exhaled. A small portion of carbon dioxide just stays dissolved in plasma. Now let's watch a video that deals with oxygen transport.
All cells need oxygen. It is the essential fuel which is necessary to enable cells to stay alive and to carry out their various activities. Bringing oxygen to the cells requires the uptake of oxygen from the air in the lungs, its transportation in the blood, and its delivery to cells all over the body. The first step is the taking up of oxygen by blood flowing through fine capillaries in the walls of the lungs' air sacs, or alveoli. The oxygen molecules change from their state as a gas freely circulating in the air, dissolving into a solution in the plasma within the capillaries of the alveoli. Once in the solution of the blood, 98% of this dissolved oxygen is taken up by passing red cells, leaving just 2% remaining in the physical solution unattached. Red cells are particularly well suited to transporting oxygen because they contain a special oxygen-binding protein known as hemoglobin. Each molecule of hemoglobin itself contains 4 molecules of heme, an iron-containing pigment, which binds oxygen loosely and reversibly. Hemoglobin that is fully saturated with oxygen is bright red and is called oxyhemoglobin. On the other hand, hemoglobin that is not saturated with oxygen is purplish blue in color and is called deoxyhemoglobin. It is heme which makes it possible for the red cells to pick up oxygen dissolved in the blood, transport it combined with hemoglobin, and release it back into the blood as oxygen in solution, ready for delivery to the various cells of the body. Hemoglobin gives up its oxygen as red cells travel through capillaries in tissues where there is a low content or partial pressure of oxygen. The partial pressure of oxygen represents the level of dissolved oxygen in plasma. As oxygen is released and again is carried in solution, the partial pressure of oxygen in the capillaries becomes greater than the partial pressure of oxygen in the surrounding tissues. This causes oxygen to move out of the capillaries into the tissues and to finally reach the cells. This graph, the oxygen dissociation curve of hemoglobin, shows why hemoglobin is particularly suited to its role in transporting oxygen. The oxygen dissociation curve demonstrates the relationship between the oxygen carried in combination with hemoglobin, the O2 saturation, and the partial pressure of oxygen in the arterial blood. The sharp upstroke and the flat plateau illustrate how oxygen is released to the tissues over a wide range of conditions. Its shape means that although the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood returning from the lungs and being pumped out by the arteries may be reduced to only 50% of the normal value, say due to lung disease or high altitude, hemoglobin will still be 85% saturated with oxygen.